The rings came off her fingers in the order he had given them to her. The thin band of Welsh gold first, then the signet with the blackbird, then the one she had never understood, the ancient thing with markings that looked like no language she had read. The velvet of the ring case was cold against her palms. The house around her breathed in its sleep. She had heard him say the name not 10 minutes ago. Through the study door, left ajar by a hand that was not careless but perhaps too weary to care. A woman's name, spoken the way a man speaks to someone he cannot stop loving. Not a conversation, a whisper. The kind that comes from the chest, not the throat. Elowyn. The word had moved through the gap in the door like smoke, and Marjorie Poole had stood in the corridor with a tray of broth she had made because he had not eaten in 3 days. She had felt the heat leave her hands before the cold reached them. Now she folded the ring case into her traveling bag. She did not pack dresses. She did not take the shawl he had brought from his years abroad, the one that smelled of cedar and something older. She took the rings because they were the contract, and leaving the rings would have meant she was still bound by it. Taking them meant she was not. A floorboard groaned behind her. "You're going then," said a voice from the doorway. Not his. Thomas Hale, the coachman who had been with the household since before Marjorie arrived, stood with his hands at his sides. His face was unreadable in the dark, but his boots were on, which meant he had not been sleeping either. "I am," she said. Thomas looked at the bag, at the ring case visible beneath the flap. He said nothing for a long time, and then, "The back gate is unlocked. I oiled the hinge last Tuesday." She almost laughed. "You knew I would need it." "I knew someone in this house would eventually." He stepped aside. The moon's bright enough to see the lane. Marjorie Poole walked out of Ashworth House with the rings she had been given by a man she had loved for 2 years and understood for none of them. The moonlight turned the gravel path silver. The air smelled of frost and turned earth, and her breath came in small, even clouds because she was counting them. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The way she steadied herself when a sauce was about to break, when the sugar was at the edge of burning. She had been his cook. That was how it had begun. That was, she supposed, what she still was. Beneath the rings and the strange, quiet marriage that had come upon her, like weather. 3 months before the night she left, everything had been flower and wanting. Marjorie Poole had arrived at Ashworth House in the autumn of 1878 with a letter of reference that did not exist, a knife roll that had seen better decades, the steady hands of a woman who had been feeding people since she was 25 and was now 32, and tired of pretending that feeding people was not a kind of love. The house belonged to one Cale Ashworth, a scholar of no particular university, who lived alone except for Thomas the coachman, and a library that smelled of paper dust and silence. He was not a lord. He was not wealthy in any way the village understood. No carriage, no tenants, no dinner parties. What he had was the house itself, older than the parish records, and a reputation for knowing things that no living man should know. She had come because the previous cook had left without notice, and the position paid fairly and asked little. She had come because her former employer, Mrs. Arden of Arden Hall in Bath, had refused to write her a reference after Marjorie had declined to falsify the household accounts. Mrs. Arden had told every house within 40 miles that Marjorie Poole was a thief, and the lie had traveled faster than Marjorie could walk. So she had walked further, to a house no one in Bath had heard of, for a man no one in Bath would think to ask. She remembered her first morning. The kitchen at Ashworth House was enormous and ancient, with a hearth wide enough to roast an ox and copper pots that had turned green with disuse. The larder held salt, oats, and dust. She had stood in the center of it, run her finger along the edge of the work table, good oak, solid, and said aloud to no one, "Right, we'll start with stock." Cale Ashworth had appeared in the kitchen doorway an hour later, drawn by the smell. She had not heard him approach, which was unusual because the flagstones were loud, and she had good ears. He stood there, tall, angular, with features that looked like they had been carved and then worn by centuries of weather. Not beautiful, striking, the way a cliff face is striking. His hands were ink-stained. His shirt was from another decade. "You are Mrs. Poole," he said. "I am." She did not turn from the pot. "And you are Mr. Ashworth, who has been living on oats and willpower for what appears to be several months." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. More like the memory of one. "Your assessment is accurate." "My assessments usually are." She lifted the ladle. "Sit down. This will be ready in 20 minutes. He sat. She noticed as she brought the bowl to the table that his hands were cold. Not cool. Cold. The way stone is cold, radiating nothing. And when she set the broth before him, his chest did not rise. She saw it clearly in the light from the window, the stillness of a body that was not breathing. She filed this away the way she filed away the ripeness of fruit, or the readiness of bread dough, noted, catalogued, returned to later. She said nothing about it. What she said was, "The stock needs better bones. Is there a butcher in the village who will deliver?" He looked at her with eyes that were gray and deep and carried something she would later understand was surprise. "I will arrange it," he said. That was the beginning. She had recognized him, of course. He did not recognize her. 7 years earlier, she had been 25 and working in the kitchens at the Highgate Assembly Rooms during a winter lecture series. A scholar had spoken about folklore, not the children's version, but the old kind, the kind that explained why certain houses lasted and others did not. He had spoken for 2 hours, and she had stood at the back of the hall with a tray of cold meats she was meant to be arranging. She had listened to every word. After the lecture, she had brought him tea because everyone else had gone. He had looked at her the way people look at a fire they did not expect to find burning. "You stayed for the entire lecture," he had said. Not a question. "You were interesting," she had said. "Most scholars aren't." He had laughed, a sound that seemed to startle him more than it startled her. They had talked for 40 minutes about the folklore of house wards and the symbolism of hearthstones, and he had asked her name. She had told him, and then the hall manager had come to close the building. And that had been that. 7 years. For her, it had been the evening she measured all other conversations against. For him, a man who had lived, she would come to understand, for over 400 years. It had been a moment. One of thousands. The tea had gone cold and the woman who brought it had been kind. And then the century had moved on. He did not recognize Marjorie Poole. She said nothing about it. She made his meals and mended his kitchen, and slowly, without either of them naming it, she became the center of his house. The proposal had come 6 months after her arrival, and it had been, like everything about Cale Ashworth, unexpected and practical. He had found her in the kitchen at dusk, kneading bread with the focus of a woman solving an equation with her hands. "I have a proposal," he said. "If it involves turnips, the answer is no. I have done everything a woman can do with a turnip. It involves marriage." Her hands stilled in the dough. She looked at him. He stood in the doorway, not quite straight, not yet falling, every surface carrying the memory of weight. "Why?" she asked. Because Mrs. Arden has written to the village magistrate claiming you are employed here under false pretenses. A married woman with her husband's household is beyond the reach of a former employer's spite." He paused. "And because I have eaten well for the first time in decades, and I find I do not want it to stop." "That," Marjorie said, pressing her knuckles into the dough, "is the most honest proposal I have ever received." "Is it the only one?" "It is the only honest one." She wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, I will marry you, but I keep my kitchen, and I keep my name on Sundays." The rings had arrived 2 days later, 3 of them in a case that smelled of age. He placed them on her fingers by the hearth, and his hands were cold, and hers were warm, and neither of them moved away. It was not at first a marriage of the heart. It was a marriage of the kitchen and the corridor and the slow accumulation of trust. Him appearing at the table each evening, her leaving a candle in the hall because she had noticed he worked late, both of them occupying the same silence with increasing comfort. He was kind. He was careful with her. He noticed when she was tired before she did, and she noticed everything about him: the cold skin, the absent breath, the way he moved through the house as if the walls remembered him better than he remembered them. She did not ask. She was a cook. She understood that some things need to rest before they rise. But then, Mrs. Arden came. The woman arrived at Ashworth House on a Tuesday in March, in a hired carriage that smelled of bath salts and grievance. Marjorie was rolling pastry when Thomas appeared in the kitchen with the expression of a man delivering bad weather. "There's a woman at the door," he said. "Says she's come about the accounts." Marjorie's hands steadied on the rolling pin. 4 strokes even. Turn. 4 strokes even. "Let her in." Mrs. Arden was exactly as Marjorie remembered. Immaculate, hard-eyed and furnished with the cold politeness of someone who uses manners the way other people use locks. She swept into the front parlor and looked at Marjorie with an expression of theatrical surprise. "Good heavens, you've married the man. How resourceful, and how predictable of you to arrive uninvited," Marjorie said. "Shall I make tea, or are you leaving before the water boils?" Mrs. Arden's smile thinned. "I have written to the magistrate, as I'm sure you know. But I've also written to the diocese. A marriage conducted under false employment, a cook with no legitimate reference, entering a gentleman's household under suspicious circumstances. The diocese takes these matters seriously." "The diocese," Marjorie said, "takes an interest in marriages where the parties complain. Neither of us has complained." "Not yet." Mrs. Arden set her gloves on the table as if planting a flag. "I made you, Marjorie. You cooked in my kitchen. You learned your trade at my table. You owe me 5 years of loyal service. And instead you left me with altered accounts and a reputation for keeping dishonest staff. I altered nothing. You asked me to alter them, and I refused. That is why I left. That is your version. It is not the version I have shared with Bath." The conversation ended with nothing resolved, which was the point. Mrs. Arden did not need resolution. She needed presence. The knowledge that she could arrive, disrupt, and depart with the threat still hanging. She left Marjorie standing in the parlor with flour on her cuffs and the rolling pin still warm from her grip. The second escalation came 3 weeks later, by letter. Mrs. Arden had contacted the supplier who delivered meat and flour to Ashworth House, informing them that Marjorie Poole was known to falsify household accounts. The supplier had canceled the arrangement. Marjorie discovered this when she walked to the village and found the butcher's boy unable to meet her eye. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashworth. Mr. Hatch says he can't extend credit to your household no longer." She stood in the village lane with the empty basket, and felt the ground shift under her, not dramatically, but in the way a woman feels it when the thing she has built starts to crack. She counted her breaths, 4 in, 4 out. She walked home and found another supplier, further away, at greater cost. She did not tell Cale, but Cale noticed. He noticed the longer walks. He noticed the strain in her hands when she thought he was not watching. And one evening, standing in the kitchen doorway while she strained stock through muslin, he said, "Someone is making your work harder." "Someone is trying to," she said. "I'm making it harder for them to succeed. Let me help. You can help by sitting down and eating what I've made." She looked at him. "I know you don't need to eat, Cale. I've known since the first day. Your chest doesn't move. Your hands are colder than the flagstones. You have been alive for a very long time, and you sustain yourself in ways I have not asked about, because it was not yet time to ask." She set the muslin aside. "But I'm asking now, not about what you are, about what you can do. Because Mrs. Arden is escalating, and I need to know what resources I have." The kitchen was silent except for the fire. He stood very still. "You knew," he said. "I'm a cook. I notice what people do and don't consume. I notice temperature. I notice when someone has not aged a single day in the 7 years since I first saw him lecture at the Highgate Assembly Rooms about the folklore of house wards." His stillness changed. It was no longer the stillness of concealment, but of recognition. Slow, astonished, the way a house recognizes its own foundation. "The woman with the tea," he said. "The woman with the cold meats, actually. The tea was incidental. I remember the conversation. You remember the conversation, but not the woman." She said it without bitterness, the way she stated cooking times, as fact. "I remember both." He crossed the kitchen. Not fast. Slowly, deliberately, each step laid down like a word he wanted to mean. He stood before her, close enough that she felt the cold air around him, and he felt the warmth around her. "I am a vampire," he said. "I have lived 431 years. I do not eat, though what you make is the closest I have come to wanting to. I am not wealthy. I am not powerful among my kind. What I have is time, and knowledge, and this house, and you. And I should have remembered you. The failing is mine." "It is," she agreed. "But I didn't marry you for your memory." He almost smiled. "Why did you marry me?" "Because you asked honestly, and because your kitchen needed me, and because—" She stopped. "Because you listened to me talk about hearthstones for 40 minutes, as if what I said mattered. It did matter. Then help me now, not by protecting me. By telling me what you know about how people like Mrs. Arden are defeated." He told her what he knew, gathered across centuries of watching households rise and crumble, was that people who control through reputation are destroyed by reputation. That the women who work in kitchens hear everything. That Mrs. Arden's power was not institutional, but personal. And personal power has personal seams. Marjorie listened. She dried her hands on her apron. She began to plan. The third escalation arrived in person. Mrs. Arden returned to Ashworth House on a bright morning in April. This time not alone. She brought a solicitor and a man from the diocese. She brought something Marjorie had not anticipated, a forged letter, supposedly in Marjorie's hand, admitting to the alteration of the Arden Hall accounts. "This document," the solicitor said, unfolding it on the parlor table, constitutes a confession. If presented to the magistrate, it would be sufficient grounds to pursue criminal proceedings against Mrs. Ashworth and to seek annulment of her marriage on the basis of fraudulent character. Marjorie stood by the fireplace. She looked at the letter. The handwriting was close. Someone had studied her hand carefully, but the capital M was wrong. Marjorie had been trained by a French chef who had taught her to write her initials in the continental style, with a serif. This letter had no serif. She said nothing about the forgery. Not yet. "Mrs. Arden," she said, keeping her voice level, "you have come a long way to deliver a document that I did not write, but I understand that you believe you are owed something. So let me tell you what I know." She looked at Mrs. Arden the way she looked at a pot that had boiled too long, with precision and without mercy. "I cooked for your household for 5 years. During that time, I fed your family, your guests, and your servants. People speak freely around the woman who feeds them. They say things at the kitchen table they would never say in the parlor." Marjorie folded her hands. "I know that the accounts you asked me to alter were designed to hide the payments you made to Mr. Collis of Bath for services that had nothing to do with household management. I know that your supplier in Walcott was overcharging you by arrangement, and that you shared the surplus. I know that your housekeeper left not because of ill health, but because she discovered the same thing, and you threatened her livelihood until she was silent." The parlor was very quiet. "I have not shared this knowledge," Marjorie continued. "I did not share it when I left your employ, and I did not share it when you began your campaign to destroy my reputation. But I am sharing it now, in this room, with your solicitor and the man from the diocese as witnesses, because you have brought a forged document into my home and threatened my marriage." Mrs. Arden's face had gone the color of old wax. "You cannot prove any of this. I don't need to prove it. I need only to say it in the right rooms, to the right people, and let Bath do what Bath does with information. You know that as well as I do. You built your power on it." Marjorie took a step forward. "Here is your choice. You withdraw the letter. You write a legitimate reference for my years of service. You leave this house, and you do not return, and you do not write to any magistrate, diocese, supplier, or tradesman about me again, or I begin speaking to the right rooms." The solicitor was looking at Mrs. Arden with the expression of a man who has just learned he is standing on thin ice. The man from the diocese had removed his spectacles and was polishing them, which is the gesture of a person who wishes to be anywhere else. Mrs. Arden chose wrong. She turned to the solicitor and said in a voice tight with fury, "Present the document. We proceed." The solicitor hesitated. "Mrs. Arden, given what has just been presented, then I will need to present it accurately," the solicitor said carefully, "including the circumstances of its presentation and the counterclaims made in this room." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Marjorie felt it settle over the parlor like flour over a work table, fine, pervasive, impossible to brush away. Mrs. Arden looked at Marjorie. For the first time, there was something in her expression that was not calculation, but recognition. The recognition of a woman who has met a force she cannot outmaneuver. "You were always too clever for a cook," she said. "And you were always too careless for a thief," Marjorie replied. Mrs. Arden left. The solicitor left with her, carrying the forged letter, which Marjorie suspected would never be presented to anyone. The man from the diocese shook Marjorie's hand, accepted a cup of tea, and departed with what could only be described as relief. Thomas, who had been standing in the hall throughout, silent, precise, hearing everything, appeared in the parlor doorway. "She won't come back," he said. "No," Marjorie agreed. "She won't." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. "You could have told him. He would have handled it." "I know he would have. That's exactly why I didn't." Thomas nodded once, the way a man nods when he has confirmed something he already suspected. He turned and went back to the stables, but as he reached the door, he paused. 7 years, he said. You remembered him for 7 years and he didn't remember you. He remembers me now. Aye, Thomas said. He does. And there was something in his voice, quiet, carrying weight, that sounded very much like approval. Cale found her in the kitchen that evening. She was making bread. The simple kind, flour and water and salt. The kind she made when she needed to think with her hands. He stood in the doorway and watched her the way he always watched her, when she did not know she was being watched, as if she were the only source of warmth in a house that had been cold for centuries. "The name," she said, without turning. "The one you whispered in the study. Elowen." He went still. "I heard you. Through the door. 3 nights ago. That's why I packed the rings." Her hands worked the dough. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. "I thought it was another woman. Someone you wanted. Someone you had." "It is your name," he said. She stopped. Turned. "Elowen is a Cornish name," he said. "It means elm tree. 400 years ago I knew a woman by that name. She was kind to me when I was newly made and frightened of what I had become. She fed me, Marjorie. Not blood. Food. She sat with me at a table and gave me bread, and spoke to me as if I were still a man. His voice was low, rough at the edges. She died. Not by violence, by time. The way mortals do. And I have whispered her name every night since, because it is the only prayer I know." Marjorie's hands were still in the dough. Why did it sound like desire? Because gratitude and grief sound the same in the dark. She looked at him, his gray eyes, the centuries in them, the careful way he held himself, as if he might shatter something precious by moving too quickly. "Elowen," she said, testing the shape of it. "I did not know when I married you why you felt familiar." He took a step into the kitchen. "I did not understand why your bread smelled like safety, or why your presence in this house made the walls feel warm for the first time in 200 years. But when you left, when I found the ring case gone and the bed cold and the kitchen empty, I understood. Because the last time I felt that particular kind of loss, it was 4 centuries ago, and the woman I lost was called Elowen." Marjorie breathed. 4 counts in. 4 counts out. "I am not her," she said. "No, you are not. You are Marjorie Poole, who makes bread that tastes like the bread she made, and who speaks to me the way she spoke, who I failed to recognize for 7 years, because I am a fool who has lived too long and paid too little attention to the things that matter." That is an accurate assessment. He was close now. Close enough that she felt the cold around him, and he felt the warmth around her. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the ring case. "I brought these back," she said, "not because you convinced me, because I convinced myself, and because the bread is rising and someone needs to be here when it's done." He looked at the case, at her, at the flour on her hands and the steadiness in her eyes. "Marjorie," he said. "That is the right name," she said. He took the case. He opened it, He placed the rings on the table beside the bread dough, where they looked small and ancient and exactly right. "I will not whisper her name again without telling you why," he said. "You will whisper her name whenever you need to," Marjorie said. "She kept you human. I will not compete with the dead, Cale. I will only ask that you remember the living woman in your kitchen as clearly as the one in your memory." "More clearly," he said. "More." The summer came slowly to Ashworth House, the way summers do in the deep countryside. Not arriving, but accumulating, warmth layering over warmth until the hedgerows buzzed, and the kitchen garden Marjorie had planted in April was producing more basil than any two people could reasonably consume. She cooked. That had not changed. But the kitchen had changed around her. New copper pots, found in the attic and polished until they sang, herbs drying in bundles from the beam above the hearth, a second work table that Cale had built himself, badly, with joints that did not quite meet, because she had said she needed more space, and he had decided that this was a problem he could solve with his hands. She had not corrected his carpentry. The table wobbled slightly to the left, and every time she rolled pastry on it, she smiled. Thomas had started eating supper in the kitchen rather than the stables, which Marjorie took as the highest compliment a coachman could offer a cook. He said little, ate thoroughly, and occasionally offered observations that landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. "He's different since you came back," Thomas said one evening, buttering bread. "Different how?" "Lighter." Thomas considered. "Like the house when you open the windows in spring. Same walls, same rooms, but the air moves." Marjorie looked through the kitchen doorway to where Cale sat in his study, visible in the lamplight, reading something that was almost certainly older than the house. He looked up, as if he felt her gaze, and something passed between them that had no name but was warm and specific in theirs. The rings were back on her fingers, the Welsh gold, the blackbird signet, and the ancient one with markings she now knew were Cornish, Elowen's language, though not Elowen's ring. Cale had made that ring himself, 4 centuries ago, from metal he had carried since the beginning. He had given it to Marjorie without knowing why it felt right. She wore it now knowing that it held the weight of all the years between the woman who first fed him and the woman who fed him still. She had not asked him to explain Elowen further. She did not need the full story yet. Some doughs need a long prove. She understood that. There were centuries in him she had not yet touched, rooms in his history she had not yet entered. The name whispered in the dark was a door she could open when the time was right. Not yet. Not now. But it was there, and she knew where it led, and that was enough. The evening settled around them. Thomas finishing his bread, Cale turning pages, Marjorie wiping down the work table that wobbled and checking the proving basket where tomorrow's loaf was rising in the warmth. The kitchen smelled of basil and good stock, and the particular scent of a house that is, finally, inhabited. Cale appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, not quite straight, not yet falling, and watched her hands move across the table in the rhythm she had carried since the first day she arrived. "Marjorie." "Cale." "The bread," he said. "It smells like the bread she made." She looked at him, steadily, without fear or competition or grief, but with the clarity of a woman who knows exactly what she holds and what it costs. "Then it's good bread," she said. "Now sit down. I've made soup, and you're going to tell me about your terrible table joints, while Thomas pretends not to laugh." Thomas, who had already begun to laugh, said nothing. Cale sat. Marjorie ladled soup into bowls that had been in the house longer than any of them and set them on a table that wobbled slightly to the left and held everything that mattered perfectly steady. Outside, the moon had risen. Inside, the proving basket breathed.